Good afternoon. I'm Todd Richardson. I'm the Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development in HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research. I want to thank you today for coming. We're going to be discussing the findings from the latest study on housing discrimination against racial and ethnic minorities 2012. Sorry, we're a few minutes late. The media, we had a media call right before this, and they're very interested in the study and lots of great questions. So before I introduce our speakers here, I want to take us back in time a little bit. As you know, there have been a number of recent reflections on the civil rights struggle in 1963. Today, June 11th, marks the 50th anniversary of the integration of the University of Alabama. So this got me a little reflective. See, I was born in 1968, so shortly before the Fair Housing Act was passed. So in my lifetime, I've lived through the lifetime of the Fair Housing Act and other civil rights acts being enforced. So implementation of these important civil rights legislation. So this also got me thinking about Father's Day. So Sunday is Father's Day, in case you've forgotten. So one of my earliest memories about implementation of the Fair Housing Act is of my father. And he ran the housing programs for the Flint, Michigan Urban League in the 1970s. And if those of you who know segregation scores and stuff, Flint is one of the more segregated communities in America. So this was very hard work. So one of my early vivid memories was my father coming home in the 1970s, very excited. And he had this new fair housing logo of a house with an equal sign in it. And then he sat down and explained to us why this was so important. So it was about this time, I'd say about 1975, HUD staff in the Office of Policy Development and Research were trying to figure out the best way to evaluate the impact of our fair housing enforcement efforts. So to figure this out, they commissioned a set of papers. The papers proposed were varied, but one stood out. It proposed using this enforcement technique, pair testing, but it proposed using it in a research way. This suggestion by economists Barton Smith and Peter Miskowski led to the 1977 national study that serves as the baseline for the 1989, 2000, and this 2012 study. So this brings me to another important point in time. Barack Obama is elected President of the United States. He appoints Sarah Donovan, Secretary of HUD. And one of Secretary Donovan's early decisions was to request from Congress funding that increased our fair housing enforcement efforts and also doubled HUD's investment in research and evaluation. And with that doubling in research funding, this 2012 study that we're going to talk about today was proposed as a top priority, and Congress endorsed that investment. So with great pleasure, I'd like to introduce Secretary Sarah Donovan.
Todd, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you for the trip down memory lane. Inspiring and almost as inspiring as your work here at the department. As you all know, Todd has been a wonderful leader of so many of our efforts here, and I just want to thank you personally, Todd, for all you do. I also want to thank the entire team at HUD that's worked on this study, our partners at the Urban Institute, Marge and others for their enormous contributions to this announcement today. And of course, I want to welcome all of you, so many friends and partners from across the country that we work with side by side every day. I am so glad that you could join us this afternoon to talk about an issue that we all care so deeply about, which is ending housing discrimination. Now, unlike Todd, I was born before 1968, and so I do want to talk about not just the enforcement, but the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, and remind everyone that we gather here today in the Brooke Mondale Auditorium. As all of you know, it was Senators Ed Brooke and Walter Mondale that sponsored the Fair Housing Act. And if you think about what that act represented, that introduction together, they were not natural partners. One was a Republican, the other a Democrat. One was African American, the other white. One represented the East Coast, and the other the Midwest. So on the surface, it's hard to believe that they agreed on anything, particularly when you work in Washington today. But they did share a common cause, helping our nation live up to the ideals that it preached, especially when it came to housing. In his memoir, Senator Mondale recalled a decades-old story of injustice that had made an impact on him. It was of a young African-American Navy lieutenant named Carlos Campbell. After a series of assignments that he performed with great distinction, he earned a post at the Pentagon, not too far from here. For many, this would have been a dream job, but there was just one problem. He couldn't find a place to live nearby. He spoke to many landlords over the phone that encouraged him to apply for their listings, but when he showed up in person, it was a very different story. He sought help from the Department of Defense, which did everything it could, but still couldn't find him a place. As Senator Mondale said himself, quote, "It was a disgrace. Here was a person good enough to perform for our country in the armed forces, but not good enough to find housing for himself and his family," end quote. The good news for our country is that stories like Carlos Campbell's of obvious, in-your-face discrimination are, for the most part, and I want to emphasize, for the most part, a thing of the past. According to the housing discrimination study we've released today, blatant acts of discrimination have declined since our first national study in 1977. In fact, now minority renters who call to inquire about a real estate ad are rarely denied appointments. So the nation has made significant strides since the Fair Housing Act was enacted in 1968. But make no mistake, we still have a long way to go. Hidden discrimination is alive and well, and in fact, if Carlos Campbell was to try and buy or rent today, chances are he'd get an appointment and see an apartment. But after that, he'd be shown and told about fewer available homes. As our study shows, real estate agents and rental housing providers recommend and show fewer available homes to minority families than equally qualified whites. Hispanic renters that reach out to an agent to see an advertised listing will be told about roughly 12% fewer other available units. For African Americans and Asian renters, the percentages are approximately 11% and 10%, respectively. Now, after my remarks, Marge will present all of the findings, so I won't dive into too much detail. I'll just stress that just because discrimination has taken on a more subtle form doesn't make it any less harmful. Anytime freedom of choice is attacked, it is a threat to ideals and values that we all care about, like diversity and equal opportunity. Imagine what is happening to all those families looking for a new home or to buy or rent, but are being denied available housing options. They might not be able to move into that community with the good school, preventing their child from getting a first-class education. They might not be able to move to that neighborhood across the tracks where the streets are safer. They might not be able to relocate to that community with all the job openings, preventing them from securing their financial future. I could go on, but the point is clear. The findings of this study are more than just numbers. They represent families being denied their fair shot at the American dream. That's why all of us at HUD are committed to working with you to push for progress. We're committed to doing this in a number of ways. We continue to vigorously enforce the Fair Housing Act and other civil rights laws so that people who think that they might be victimized by illegal housing or lending discrimination can get help in bringing their complaints forward. In addition, we're using technology to make it easier to report discrimination. Recently, HUD unveiled the first housing discrimination app for the iPhone and the iPad. Now, with a few swipes of a finger, users can quickly learn about their fair housing rights and pursue discrimination complaints. We also continue to work closely with partners to promote equal access to housing. We fund private fair housing organizations that use special techniques to collect evidence about possible discrimination in over 100 communities around the country. We also provide technical assistance to communities that have structural fair housing problems, whether they be the lack of a fair housing presence in their community, historical patterns of segregation, or a lack of opportunities for minorities in neighborhoods with quality schools, transportation, and other vital community services. Finally, I pledge to you that HUD is firmly committed to shining a spotlight on discrimination as we are today. Too many people think that this issue is a problem of the past, one that ended when Todd was born and the civil rights era was at its height. That's why we're highlighting racial and ethnic injustice as it stands in modern times with today's report. In addition, we'll soon be releasing a housing discrimination study focused on the LGBT community. Also in the pipeline, we're doing research as it relates to families with children and source of income. With this information, we're going to increase awareness about these important issues. We're going to identify discrimination wherever it exists. We're going to speak up about it to ensure that these injustices are never swept under the rug. And we're going to stand up with you for equality and fairness in our housing market. Together, we've done a lot of work on these issues, and I look forward to continuing to work with you to knock housing discrimination out of the market once and for all. So now, I have the honor of introducing our next speaker. As I said earlier, HUD was proud to partner with the Urban Institute to author this study, and Marge Turner played a leadership role in this remarkable work. Marge is the Senior Vice President for Program Planning and Management and has been one of America's most important voices regarding issues of racial and ethnic discrimination for more than 20 years, including a period of leadership here at HUD when she did remarkable work on this issue, but on so many others as well that PD&R was taking on. She played an integral role in the studies that HUD did in 1989 as well as 2000. After that last experience, I've been told that Marge said she would never do it again. Is this true, Marge? True, Marge?
It's true.
Oh, it's true. But I am so glad, as I know you all are, that she changed her mind. The result of her changing her mind is a remarkable piece of research that's both informative and illuminating. And I'm so glad that she's here today to present the findings of the latest housing discrimination study. Please help me give a warm HUD welcome to Marge Turner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. The Urban Institute is really proud to be HUD's partner in conducting these studies. I want to be sure to say that this work really wouldn't be possible without the collaboration of HUD's wonderful research and fair housing staff, or without the terrific team of Urban Institute experts on sampling and statistics and field management and database development. So I would just like to acknowledge the HUD staff and the Urban Institute team members who are able to be here today. This afternoon, I'm going to begin by re-summarizing our top-line findings, and then I'll back up, dig in, and give you some more detailed background and specifics about the results. When well-qualified minority home seekers contact housing providers to inquire about recently advertised housing units, they generally are just as likely as equally qualified whites to get an appointment and to learn about at least one available housing unit. But when differences in treatment occur, it's white home seekers who are more likely to get the favorable treatment than are minorities. And most importantly, minority home seekers are told about and shown fewer homes and apartments than they would if they were white. So here are the numbers. Let's look at the rental market first, which is in blue. So black renters are told about 11% fewer units and shown 4% fewer than equally qualified white renters. Hispanics told about 13% fewer and shown 8% fewer. Asians told about 10% fewer units and shown 7% fewer. So shift to the sales market, which is orange. Black home buyers are told about 17% fewer available homes and shown 18% fewer. And Asians are told about 16% fewer homes and shown 19% fewer than if they were white. The differences for Hispanic home buyers aren't statistically significant. That's something of a puzzle, and I'll come back to it later. So let me just give an example of what these kinds of numbers mean in person. In one of our rental tests, the Asian tester visited first. She met with an agent and asked about the advertised 2-bedroom unit. She was told that that unit was available and she was able to inspect it, but no other 2-bedroom units were available for her. A couple hours later, the white tester visited the same agent and saw that same advertised 2-bedroom unit, but was also told about 4 more 2-bedroom units that were available in other locations managed by the same company. So that kind of discrimination matters. It raises the cost of housing search for minorities, and it restricts their housing options. So where do these results come from? As you've heard, beginning in the late 1970s, HUD has rigorously monitored trends in racial and ethnic discrimination roughly once every decade through a series of these national paired testing studies. Now, in a paired test, 2 people, one white and the other minority, pose as equally qualified home seekers, and they inquire about homes or apartments that have been recently advertised as available. Paired testing offers us this uniquely effective tool for directly observing unequal treatment of equally qualified home seekers. Essentially, it catches discrimination in the act. I need to be sure you know, however, that despite the power of this methodology, paired testing can't capture all the forms of discrimination that might occur in a person's housing search. And the results presented here don't necessarily reflect the experience of the average or typical minority home seeker, because our testers presented themselves as unambiguously well qualified for the advertised homes and apartments that they were inquiring about. So the results that are reported here are conservative estimates. They probably understate the total level of discrimination that occurs in the marketplace. Now, every one of these decennial testing studies has had to adapt to evolving market conditions and changing market practices. And in designing this study, we were particularly concerned about the increased use of the internet by home seekers, but also by housing providers. And we were concerned about the effects of the foreclosure crisis and the Great Recession, particularly on sales markets, which were extremely weak, but also on rental markets, some of which were actually overheated. So our primary goal in the design of this study was to produce the best possible estimates of current discrimination at the national level. So we drew a new nationally representative sample of metropolitan areas instead of returning and testing again in the metros that we had studied before. We drew a sample of housing providers to test from advertisements in the online sources that most home seekers use today. We modified our research testing protocols so that they could capture potential discrimination at the telephone or email inquiry stage before people even meet in person with agents. And we updated the statistical methods we use to construct our overall summary measures of discrimination. And here's how our tests were conducted. For a randomly selected sample of ads, both white and minority members of a tester pair used phone or, in some cases, email to try to schedule an in-person appointment. If they could get an appointment, they went in person and inquired about available homes or apartments. If at least one unit was available to them, they tried to inspect that and other available units. And for sales tests, we independently captured the neighborhood characteristics of the homes that were available and shown to the testers. In all, we conducted 8,000 paired tests in 28 metro areas between the late summer of 2011 and the early fall of 2012. So I'm going to give you some more details on our findings, going step by step through the stages of a test and starting in the rental market. So minority renters who call to inquire about advertised homes and apartments are rarely denied appointments that their white counterparts are able to make. In the vast majority of tests, if one tester is able to make an appointment, then they both are. When renters meet in person with housing providers, they're almost always told about at least one available unit. But Hispanic renters are slightly more likely than equally qualified whites to be told no homes or apartments are available when they show up in person. That's a small difference, but a statistically significant one. In about half of these in-person visits, one tester learns about more available units than the other does. In other words, one tester is favored over the others, and it's more often the white who is favored than the minority, therefore finding out about more units. And finally, in about a third of in-person visits, one tester is shown more units than his or her partner, and again, whites are significantly more likely to be the favored member of the pair. So that brings us back to the headline numbers I started with. Taking all three of those steps into account, minorities learn about 10 to 12% fewer units than they would if they were white, and they're shown 4 to 7% fewer. So shifting to the sales market, again, like renters, minority home buyers are rarely denied appointments that their white counterparts are able to make. But, black homebuyers are slightly more likely than equally qualified whites to be denied an in-person appointment, another small but statistically significant difference in treatment. When homebuyers meet in person with housing providers, they're usually told about at least one available unit, but agents frequently tell one tester about more available homes than the other, with whites significantly more likely to learn about more units than either blacks or Asians. And finally, in about 2/3 of the in-person visits, one tester is shown more units than his or her partner, and again, whites are significantly more likely to be favored than blacks or Asians. Asians is the category disadvantaged. So taking all three of those steps into account, black and Asian homebuyers are told about 16 to 17% fewer units than if they were white, and shown 18 to 19% fewer. So these overall differences in treatment for Hispanic homebuyers aren't statistically significant. And we dug into that finding and confirmed that that result extends across many forms of treatment. It's not that the discrimination is popping up somewhere else in the transaction, and that it applied in all the metropolitan areas where Hispanic homeownership testing was conducting. And as you'll see later, it's actually consistent with the downward trend that we saw between 1989 and 2000. So what about geographic steering of home buyers, the neighborhoods in which they were recommended and shown homes? So most of the for sale homes that were recommended or shown to testers of all races and ethnicities were located in majority white neighborhoods. In many cases, however, one tester was recommended and shown homes in whiter neighborhoods on average than the partner tester, and whites were significantly more likely than blacks or Asians to be shown these whiter neighborhoods. However, in some cases, minorities were shown whiter neighborhoods than their white partners. And as a consequence, across all tests, the average racial composition of neighborhoods recommended to whites is only slightly whiter, 2 percentage points whiter, than the average racial composition of the neighborhoods recommended to blacks and Asians. In other words, over multiple inquiries, the composition of the neighborhoods recommended to well-qualified minority home buyers is very similar to the composition of the neighborhoods that are recommended to equally qualified whites. So how has discrimination changed since the first national paired testing study that HUD sponsored in 1977? So because the housing markets and housing market practices have changed, and sampling methods and testing protocols have changed in response, results from these 4 decennial paired testing studies can't be precisely compared, but they do give us a good qualitative picture of the trends in the adverse treatment of minority home seekers. And what we're focusing on here are the long-term trends in 2 important measures of discrimination against blacks and Hispanics. Whether the agent told only the white tester that the advertised unit was available, that's the blue line, and whether the white tester was shown more units than the minority, that's the orange line. So Asians were not included in these national studies until 2000, so we don't have this long-term trend study for them. So let me tell the story of these charts. In '77, black renters and buyers were frequently denied access to advertised units. This kind of door-slamming discrimination had declined dramatically by '89 and has continued to decline since. For the number of units shown, discrimination against black renters actually increased between '77 and '89, but has declined since then. And this form of discrimination against black home buyers has essentially stayed constant. It hasn't changed appreciably since 1977. So Hispanics were first included in these studies in 1989, and denial of advertised units to Hispanic renters has dropped substantially since then, while discrimination on the number of units shown seems to have declined between '89 and 2000 and then gotten stuck, pretty much stayed the same between 2000 and 2012. Both these forms of adverse treatment of Hispanic homebuyers dropped substantially between '89 and 2000 and remained low, essentially too low to capture statistically through 2012. That apparent blip up is inside the statistical margins of error. So taken together, these findings suggest that the blatant door-slamming discrimination that was observed in the earliest paired testing studies is much less frequent today, but that other, less easily detectable forms of discrimination persist, really limiting the information and the choices that are offered to minority home seekers. I want to be very clear that the fact that blatant discrimination against well-qualified minority home seekers is rare doesn't mean it never happens, and it doesn't mean that more marginally qualified home seekers don't face considerably more frequent or more severe barriers to their housing choice. So thinking about these long-term trends in patterns of discrimination suggests to me that the attitudes and actions of rental and sales agents have changed over time, and that the investments we've been making in fair housing enforcement and public education are working. But that doesn't mean that we should abandon our fair housing enforcement efforts. The forms of discrimination that are documented by this study are very difficult for a victim to detect. In fact, I don't know how a victim would detect the fact that they were shown fewer units than they would have been shown were they white. So enforcement strategies shouldn't rely primarily on individual complaints of suspected discrimination. HUD should encourage the local fair housing organizations that it funds to conduct more proactive testing, especially in the sales market, which is tough, where discrimination is higher than in the rental market. And in addition, our findings suggest that local fair housing organizations should be reaching out to expand and strengthen their relationships with Hispanic and Asian communities to tackle the discrimination that's experienced by all people of color. So before I close, I just want to raise the question of how these findings relate to the larger questions of residential segregation and unequal access to neighborhood amenities and neighborhood opportunities. We all know that discrimination helped create and perpetuate segregated and unequal neighborhoods. But the levels and forms of housing discrimination captured in this paired testing study can't fully explain the current levels, the current persistence of segregation. So the evidence from this and from considerable other research argues for the kind of multi-pronged strategy that the Secretary described, including vigorous enforcement of anti-discrimination protections along with housing counseling and search assistance, local regulatory reforms, affordable housing development, and neighborhood reinvestment. Really, all these elements are needed to achieve the fundamental goals of free and fair housing choice and healthy, opportunity-rich neighborhoods for Americans of all races and ethnicities. So, with that, I will leave this graphic summary of our top-line findings and turn the mic over to Sarah Pratt.
I have them both beat. I participated in the 1977 housing discrimination study, which makes me at least 50 years older than both of you, I'm pretty sure. As a young lawyer at the Kentucky Commission on Human Rights, I was investigating housing discrimination cases. I reviewed all the HDS tests that my agency conducted both in Louisville and Lexington, Kentucky, and concocted a testing methodology off of them, which we later used for testing for enforcement purposes. I'm pleased to be here with you today to reflect a little bit with you on the results of the 2012 housing discrimination study. I was most interested, Marge, in the trends graphs showing what things are looking like over time. To me, they do not, however, signify, as Marge suggests, that we should close our doors and stop doing fair housing enforcement by any stretch of the imagination. The work that we're doing here at HUD to enforce the civil rights laws, especially the Fair Housing Act, I trust you all know is critically important. And what we see from the HDS results in 2012 reminds us both of progress made, and those trend charts tells us some things about progress made, but simultaneously remind us that well-qualified applicants in the rental and sales market still encounter significant levels of discrimination based on race and national origin. If you work in the world that I work in, the accomplishment of zero levels of discrimination is a goal that may never, in fact, be attained, although we might dream that it would be. But to see trends over time where there's significant changes are important to recognize, one, that the work that we do brings change, and two, that some of the work that we do and have been reported in the HDS studies shows qualitative and quantitative change over time. But yet, and still, the knock at the door of available housing isn't always answered, and it isn't always answered in the same way if you're Black or Latino than it is when you're white. The search for housing today still isn't just about a transaction between a landlord or a sales agent looking for a qualified renter or buyer. But this evidence tells us that in a significant number of instances, we continue to see illegal discrimination that is shaping the marketplace. And I think it's important to recognize that fact while saying, yes, maybe there's some progress indicated here, but also to recognize that there is more that we need to do to address some of the patterns, some of the highlights of this report. I take with due consideration Marge's suggestion about, especially in the area about continued testing activities, continued outreach into particular communities, both to understand the cultures and the individuals in those communities and help them know their rights, and also to make sure that we have appropriate numbers of testers from those communities to conduct these activities. I would take under advisement particularly recommendations about the sales testing projects, because I would agree that with the sales market being as bleak as it has been in many communities over the last few years, we need another round of thinking and talking about sales testing for enforcement purposes as the economy is picking up, as the sales market is picking up. I also want to point out with great clarity that there are many ways in which housing discrimination occurs, which we see in our investigations here at HUD, that would not have been captured by this study. We still see many examples of overt and hateful discrimination based on race or national origin. Sometimes it's more carefully camouflaged. We don't want any more refugees, but I believe that would be national origin discrimination. Or we don't want anyone who cannot speak and read English well, but that correlates into national origin discrimination. We see hateful and overt discrimination, especially with smaller landlords, with mobile home parks in smaller communities than we do in some of the larger cities that are reported in this community. And we still see hateful and discriminatory conduct at the community level from neighborhood organizations, from decision makers, from homeowners organizations that control housing. We still see discriminatory practices through word of mouth marketing of all white communities, something that communities that would never make it into the conventional advertising sources to even be examined in HDS, because the way they talk and tell people about vacancies does not use either the internet or the conventional newspapers to advertise their vacancies. We continue to see many examples where systemic discrimination occurs. So even in situations where there might be an incident of discrimination, where our investigations have been expanded to investigate practices at other properties owned or operated by the same companies, because while a particular test may only capture an experience in one rental property, for example, our investigations will go broader and see if the same kinds of practices are occurring at other places. We also see many examples where discrimination occurs in our investigations as we identify further along in the practice, further along in the transaction, so that it's not just knock at the front door, let me see some units, but it's at the point at which the application gets mysteriously lost, where a house or an apartment mysteriously disappears from the market. It's going to be rented or sold to my girlfriend, boyfriend, niece, nephew, cousin. It's just not available for rental anymore. Or where the applicant believes that they're on the waiting list and they wait, then they wait, then they wait. Or where a later applicant gets selected over an earlier, better qualified Black or Latino applicant. So in the rental transaction or in the sales transactions, you see the incidence of discrimination occurring later in the transaction, something that would not be captured through HDS. We also see discrimination in forms that are not unequal treatment. And as has been described, the testing evidence is essentially about whether people with all similar characteristics other than their membership as a person of color, whether that inequality of treatment results in differences in treatment. But our work is strongly also focusing on policies or practices that are consistently applied and which yet discriminate. And so we look at discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders. We issued some major findings in just a large Midwestern city this week, maybe yesterday, about the use of the treatment of Section 8 voucher holders. We have discussed and see cases involving overly restrictive residency preferences, application of occupancy standards, and other policies and practices which limit opportunity for Black and Latino renters and purchasers. And of course, as Marge mentioned, we also see in community after community patterns of segregated neighborhoods that are attributable to various forms of discriminatory decision-making, including individual decision-making by rental market personnel and by sales market personnel. We do know that this exposure to discrimination and segregation has adverse effects on our communities and on residents in those communities. We know that discrimination and segregation cause separation, cause alienation, and cause disconnects for people and for their communities. We know study after study has correlated adverse health consequences correlated to discrimination and segregation. We know the connections between school quality, and we know that those patterns, those macro patterns in our community, have not yet been fully addressed. So as we make progress on individual instances and individual transactions, we become freer, or perhaps we already were freer, to devote our attention to systemic patterns, to deeper and more entrenched patterns of segregation and institutional discrimination. And that perhaps is what it is time for us to do. We're lucky here at HUD. The leadership of Secretary Donovan continues to be very important to our efforts, and he's not here, and I'm going to say it anyway. We appreciate his commitment and support in this work. That is not always the case in this department, and the Secretary has been supportive of our work, interested in it, and continues and will continue, I believe, to support the kind of deeper work that we're doing on these issues. So Dr. King talked about us all being tied together in a single garment of destiny, an inescapable network of mutuality. I cannot close my remarks without reminding us that the issuance of this study today should remind us of how closely tied our work is, and I mean the work of all of us here in this room, all of us, to strengthening and revitalizing our communities and our country. Thank you.
So we have some time for some questions and answers. So we have microphones in the room. I'd ask that you come up to the microphone if you have a question. While people begin to line up, I would like to ask the folks from the Urban Institute and from HUD who worked on the study to stand up. It's good to acknowledge the many people it takes to make these studies work. Carol, Mark, Judd. So, I don't know, are there questions? Do folks have questions? Are the findings, I know Marge is exceedingly clear.
What I've never understood about the study is who are these housing providers? I mean, my experience in looking for rental housing is that usually a small landlord won't have another unit to show, there won't be one available, even if, so they don't make a decision. But it often sounds, maybe a big building will have an agent who could show other units. So I don't know if that you're mostly visiting big buildings, or if most of the time, or if it's really shocking that this happened, that so many people are shown fewer units, because most of the time that's not even an option. And also, but I have the same question about owner-occupied housing. There, I even understand your study less, because it's not, I mean, in my experience, the way you shop for owner-occupied housing is not to read an ad and then go apply. Usually, I was under the impression that very rarely will you get an appointment that way unless you already have a real estate broker. So could you elaborate?
Sure. So on the rental side, the housing providers that we tested are really representative of the diversity of housing providers in the 28 metropolitan areas where the testing was conducted. So it included large and small providers. The way that this methodology works is that we sample advertisements, current advertisements, and that way we get a representative mix of what's in the market. And some of them have only the one unit. Some of them have multiple units in that building. Some of them manage multiple buildings. So the results that we're presenting here, this is a market-wide, national sort of snapshot of the overall picture. On the sales side, we're again responding to ads, and it's a call to the agent associated with that ad. So indeed, you're right, you're not applying to that advertised home, but in effect, advertised homes are bait for agents. You respond to that bait, and you end up talking to an agent about other homes that are available on the market that agent can tell you about and show you.
Phil Tegler from Poverty and Race Research Action Council. I think you may have partly answered one of my two questions just now, but I'm going to restate it again. And this is a really impressive report, although I've only seen the executive summary, but I look forward to seeing the rest of it later. My two questions are probably in the longer report, so I apologize in advance. But first of all, on the rental discrimination, you just said there's a sampling, basically, of the metro areas of available rental listings. From the perspective of our fair housing work, we do see a lot of discrimination in the more exclusionary, predominantly white communities. That seems, at least in my experience, to be somewhat higher than your average. Is that reflected in the fact that you're sampling available rental listings? In other words, you're not, these rental listings that are being tested are not primarily in the more exclusionary white communities. Is that right? Or
Well,
how does it break out across metros geographically?
So we did some careful analysis to make sure that our samples for testing did match the spatial distribution of rental housing and homeowner housing across the metropolitan area. But you make an important point, and it's one that Sarah made too. Our testing window on the market is the public advertisement. So to the extent that some neighborhoods, some communities, some providers are staying out of that public window and advertising on the bulletin board or by word of mouth or in some little community paper, they wouldn't be in our sample. That's one of several examples of ways in which this methodology is conservative, and this has been true of each of these studies going along. They've made conservative choices to essentially produce a lower bound estimate of what the well-qualified minority home seeker faces.
Does the longer report, the full report, have appendices that go into submarkets within metros, or is it all aggregated at the metro level?
It's really all aggregated because to produce statistically meaningful results, you need a large number of tests. And so in this study, we have a large number of tests to tell a national story. I actually think that an important next step, whether it's for research or for enforcement, is to do moderately large number of tests in particular areas of concern. Particular neighborhoods, submarkets, types of housing providers, types of home seekers.
There's nobody behind me, so can I ask another? Or
We'll call this, there is someone else who'd like to speak, but you can wait, you can get the next question, Phil, after.
Okay, go ahead, Lisa.
And then you can come back.
Yeah, don't go away, Phil.
Good afternoon, Lisa Hasegawa with National Capacity, the Coalition for Asian Pacific American Community Development. It's great to see this study. I was eagerly awaiting, and perhaps this is in the full report. I know that in 2000 there was an issue of sample size for some of the Asian subpopulations, and I'm just wondering if you guys tried to tackle that again, and if that's going to be in the full report. And then I just also would love your thoughts on, we're about to come out with a study as well on poverty, and one of the findings is that many Asian American poor people live in very high cost areas, and so one of the things that we see that's happening is displacement, right? And so in these high cost areas, very San Francisco financial district, people are being displaced, and so I'm just wondering if there's any kind of measures in the future about people who are being pushed out of high opportunity neighborhoods, if that's going to be something that you're going to be looking at in the future. Thank you.
So I think the looking at in the future, I should defer to you.
So we should talk. I don't know of any particular plan on either aspect of the questions that they're asking. We're always in a budget planning process, and you may have heard of the word sequestration, but I don't want to mention that. I don't want to depress us even more. The issue of targeting activities in communities, in particular, focusing on discrimination encountered by individual groups, such as the groups you mentioned, is certainly on our radar screen and an important one to us. On the issue of displacement, that's a somewhat different issue, and one that we would be interested in talking to you about to see if there are issues that we can get our arms around, so to speak.
Yep, so again, the priority in this study was to produce national estimates. So we don't have estimates for national origin subgroups of either Hispanics or Asians. What we have done, and it's what we did in 2000 as well, is work very hard with the local testing organizations to make sure that the mix of Asian testers in each metro was reflective of the mix of the Asian population in that metropolitan area. So what we can say is that we reflect the diversity of the nation's Asian population, but aren't able to break down the results.
My name is Cheryl Frost Brown, and I have a question. Where, as a country, we are becoming more and more diverse, and you started to speak, or you mentioned earlier, about use email, the initial contact with these housing providers, and I'm interested in your feedback on accents and racially identifiable names as it played out in your investigation.
That was a big issue for us in this study. In the past, we really didn't start recording what happened to the white and minority tester until they were meeting in person with an agent, so that we felt the agent saw them both and formed a fairly reliable conclusion about race and ethnicity. But a lot of people were critical in 2000, arguing that there could be considerable discrimination happening through phone screening and message non-response. So we revised our protocols this year so that we really did start recording what happened to people at the phone call stage. In most cases, this inquiry for an appointment was by phone. Some cases, it was by email. So we decided to have our testers essentially be as racially identifiable as they actually were. Most of the Hispanic testers had Hispanic surnames. Some of the Asian testers had recognizable names. People spoke in those phone calls the way they speak. We didn't have actors posing as more or less identifiable. We then, independently of all that, did a careful coding process using voice recordings, names, and photos, so that we coded each tester based on how identifiable that tester was over the phone and how identifiable that tester was in person. And what we found is that the more identifiably minority a person is, the higher the incidence of discrimination at the phone stage and in the in-person stage. It isn't a huge difference, but it is a measurable difference.
So not seeing any other questions, the full report is on our website, www.huduser.org. Should be right on the front page, so you can download that.
HUD user.
HUD user.
Could you say it again into the microphone? You slurred it a little bit.
I'm sorry. HUD user, HUDUSER.org. Must be my Midwestern roots here.
Must be your youth.
Anyways, so thank you all very much for coming today. We really appreciate your time and look forward to working with you over the next decade.